And let me just say welcome to everybody who's joining us for our series, Lean Into Your Faith, Meeting Professional Challenges with Spiritual Resources today. Just a little bit about the series before we go ahead and get started. The series was really inspired to feature the wisdom of professional women who've achieved a high level of leadership and who have led from the foundation of their faith. So the women featured in each of these sessions, they hail from many different sectors, disciplines, faith backgrounds, and they've encountered a few challenges along the way, and yet have ultimately, in various ways, triumphed over them. And so they come to our series to share their experience along with just some helpful advice and wisdom and tools, which we fellow women can utilize in our efforts to build our confidence, live out our faith, and pursue our passions for global change. And so, just a little bit about the format that you see before you. First of all, welcome to Adobe Connect, the wonderful world of online webinars. You'll notice that our lovely speaker, Miss Afeefa, is up on webcam, and she and I have audio access. The webinar is an open chat format, so we encourage you to engage in the chat box below to introduce yourself, share your own wisdom, and ask any questions along the way. Our speaker will provide approximately about 20 minutes of presentation, which time she'll open up Q&A and address any questions that you posted in the chat box. Ms. Fifa, I'm going to provide a little bit of an introduction. A lot of us know you already, but our feature speaker for today, Ms. Afeefa Syeed, will be sharing with us some of her wisdom on prayerfully planning, using faith in the strategic planning process. And Afeefa is a dear friend who also serves as a senior fellow for IGE's Center for Women, Faith, and Leadership. She's also a former senior advisor at the U.S. Agency for International Development, where she worked with USAID staff in Washington and the field, developing policy, defining best practices, highlighting success stories, and otherwise building internal capacity and tools to frame country strategies that both reflected greater expertise in engaging the cultural context that were served. Afeefa designed and implemented initiatives and training to address engaging traditional and religious leaders and institutions, radicalization, socio-political identity, mainstreaming gender, social entrepreneurship, and other emerging programs. Afeefa is also a cultural anthropologist and has worked in communities in Europe, Southeast Asia, South Asia, Central Asia, and the Middle East and North Africa. So pretty much everywhere. And Afeefa has worked for the past 25 years with various international grassroots NGOs and development agencies in the areas of youth and women participation in leadership, civic education and engagement, good governance, education and curriculum reform, and advocacy. And you'll see Afeefa is in her office in the school that she founded, whose core curriculum is peace education and civic engagement. And she's a member of various interfaith social service and advocacy organizations in the U.S. So with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to you, Afeefa. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kristen. It's always a pleasure to be with you, especially, and then with the IGE CWFL family for sure. As you mentioned, I am at the school, so I strategically placed myself in front of the whiteboard that has some very important messages that I have not been able to decipher yet from our students. So I thought if I'm sitting here and if I start to fade out in you, then you can try to figure out what the messages are behind me and then let me know if you come up with something. That would be very helpful. But we have lots of spaces here in the school for children to express themselves, and sometimes we're not quite sure what they're expressing. But I thought I would loop you into that process as well while I'm here. I also just came from the preschool room where we are practicing deep breathing with them, but then also I was mentioning to Kristen, we're also doing deep breathing and a lot of just reflective exercises with all our students. And we have students from preschool to eighth grade. And it's really amazing to see how they take something like deep breathing, which is an exercise, a practice, and they become strategic with it. And they're doing some interesting things with regulating themselves and also connecting with each other through breathing. So I wanted to start with that just because that's been my day today, but it also feeds into this concept or this idea we're going to talk about with strategy and with planning, and the fact that we can get these tools, we can get ideas from just about everywhere, and strategy can mean a lot of different things, and we'll talk about that a little bit. I have to admit this is a little bit awkward for me because I'm so used to an interactive format. So I say things and I wait for people to respond, and it's kind of more not just interesting for me, but I think it's more productive. So I'm going to try my best to have a monologue. But for sure, please do use the chat spot there so that if you want to throw something at me while I'm talking, I would actually appreciate it. I don't see it as interruption. It helps the flow, and we could definitely go into a different direction if it feels like that something might be more helpful to you. And I think we're a close enough group that we can probably do that in a way that's not too disruptive. So that's my disclaimer. You might also hear some students in the background either singing or doing something student-like. So I hope that doesn't interrupt anything either, but just see it as part of the ambiance that we have together today that you're sharing with me. Okay, so what I have talked about strategic planning before with just our leaders that we had, the fellows that we had, and we talked through it and we talked about how it's relevant and not relevant to what we do. So I thought maybe I will just use it as a umbrella approach to strategic planning, whether it's for us as individuals, us in our institutional or organizational capacity, and otherwise. And I'd like to hear from you all, what else you would use it in or what else it's relevant for you in. So strategic planning really is part of a process. It's part of something that's a cycle. It's not something that you do in terms of strategy just out of the blue or out of context. It does fit with a cycle. It does fit with something that is connected. And as you can see from this image, it's a circle. So it keeps on going. It's not this that you plan and then you're done by the time you evaluate. You're continuously in this, some people would say a vicious cycle, but it's not. It's a healthy cycle that keeps us going in terms of our work and in terms of our own, I would say even in our own lives. So I wanted to make sure that we know that what we're talking about is in the context of something bigger than just what we're talking about today. So I am a lover of etymology, which means I'm always wondering where words and where concepts come from. So of course I was trying to think through, all right, when we talk about strategic planning, where is this concept coming from? Why is it even something that we hear all the time? And it's, quite obvious that it comes from Greek, and it is general of the army is what it actually means. And it's interesting that it is a very I guess in some contexts you would say it's very warlike, or it's very much in a battle mode, and it's something that means something that's going to put everyone together and make something happen in terms of winning or conquest or anything you think of when you think of an army. But it does mean something that is going to help us win something. So that sounds like it's very warlike. It sounds like it's very much something out of the realm of most of what we do on a regular basis, which is hopefully not warlike, but it isn't necessarily as, I don't know, as heavy maybe. Strategy for us can just mean a strategy of parenting or a strategy of getting something done. A strategy can be just how to get from point A to point B. So a strategy for us could be just any of those things. But the fact that it has this heavy origin is also kind of interesting to think about. But I do want to focus on and kind of bring attention to the other um, quote that I put there, because this is something that, kind of permeates through everything I think about. But I also want to highlight it before we go into further into the strategy part of the conversation, which is that even though I showed you that cycle, even though you saw this, and I said it's part of this and so on, it's not just the starting point, and it's not just the first thing and the last thing that we do. It's part of the process. Um, and being part of the process means that it's something that is being fed into. So you're always connecting to a strategy, but it's also something that you could edit out of. So it's something that's dynamic, that can change. So therefore, it is not written in stone. A lot of people are concerned, well, when you have a strategy, then you're stuck with it and you can't deviate from that. And then once you say, I have this strategy, whether it's for your organization or for your individual self, then then what can you do? You kind of have to refer to that and you're stuck with it. But at the same time, as this quote continues, and this is why I like it, is because it is about evolution, and about change. So if there's a way to understand that strategy is something that builds and again can be rebuilt in a way, you can have a core of it, but you can always do some finagling of it to do something that's different. And in fact, if you do that and it's responsive and it's reflective, it's actually stronger than what you just first started out with, because you're being much more mindful and understanding of it. So that's kind of a premise that we want to start with when we talk about what strategy is, and not think about it as something that's um, untouchable or unreachable or even inaccessible, because it's something that is so set in stone. So that's kind of get that out of the way. So as we talk about it more definitionally, we'll go back to this idea that it's not set in stone. And this is one of the reasons that people are concerned about strategy, because when you think of strategy, you think of, oh, there's so much going on. There's so much that has to happen to create a strategy, or there's so much that has to be put into it. And it just looks, from the outside, looks like a mess. It looks like too much to be able to actually engage on, because it's because we've been told and we know strategy. And if you go back to what the Greeks are telling us, or in the etymology of it, it does mean something that you want to go towards winning, and you want to do it right, and you want to do it with success. You want to do it with impact. And these are all words that come up when you think about a strategy. And so we all get a little bit overwhelmed with, okay, I don't know how to put a strategy together necessarily that will have all that impact. So it becomes a little bit intimidating, and it becomes something that we're not quite sure that we want to be uh, to be quickly figure out how to do, and then also be able to implement. So that's a concern people have. What we want to talk about is strategy in the realm of what many of us are involved in, which is leadership. And sometimes it's leadership that we don't necessarily um, look for or are asking for, but are put into those positions of leadership. It means leadership in the sense of, somebody has to coordinate, or somebody has to do or make something happen. So we may be put into that position. It can also obviously mean that you are put into the position of leadership, whether it's a body is asked or has elected you to be leader, obviously, or that you're a leader of your faith community, and you feel the need and the desire to make that leadership be as effective as possible. So you'll be thinking about strategy. Community engagement, of course, is part. It could be part of leadership, or it could just be you're working on a project or something in the realm of your organization or in your community, and how are you going to have community engagement and have a strategy that's a part of that, and how will the strategy that you build have community engagement as part of it? That's also a part of the conversation. And the last one, which is mentorship, well, I think we talk more and more about this, especially as women of faith leaders, because we look at how do we help others to become leaders that are effective, and then how do I, as a leader, seek mentorship so that I can be a better leader, or I can have better impact in my organizational capacity and otherwise. So all of these three very broad sort of buckets affect strategy, and strategy affects them. So that's another sort of a framing device that I wanted to use with us today as we think about as we think about the next parts of what we're going to do. Um, I've used this example a couple of times, and I wanted to just share it again because it's just a nice, for me, it's a nice way to think about these components. This was that in 2002, there was a group of women that would get together in Nashville, and they're from the Baptist church, and they just really were very profoundly affected by the power of prayer, and they felt they wanted to get together just to pray, and they would come together, pray, and think about all the things that needed fixing in the world and just pray towards those things. It was very cathartic for them, and it was also something that they felt was doing something for the world by praying and putting out there. And I think what happened, well, in this group particularly, they were praying so fervently and they were praying so conscientiously. They were got this nickname of being the wild group of praying women in 2002. But then they started to, as they were creating community within themselves and creating a connection, they started to think about, well, what is it that we can pray about, or what is it something that we can do with our prayer as well. And then when they would pray about anybody that needed help, then they started to think about it. But then instead of just saying, well, let's just pick something, they did a community survey, and they surveyed all these agencies, and they surveyed other folks, and found out that one of the biggest needs of their community, which was there in Middle Tennessee, was that women were coming out of prison and didn't have anywhere to go, or didn't have services or ability to be taken care of. So this group of prayer group of women decided to take that on and then be more intentional about it. And that's when they started to realize that building a strategy would be something that they could look at more carefully. Kristen, I'm seeing that you have a question about, are there other words to use for strategy or strategic plan that are more inviting for people who would normally be turned off by the term? That's a really good question. I want to get back to that at the end of this because I want to go through some other ideas about what strategic planning is, and I think if you all can think about that, the question that Kristen is asking about the words really, let's come back to that and see if we can come up maybe with other words or just another way to frame it. But I just want to touch on a couple of other things in terms of what it does for us. So just to cap off this Nashville group, they came up with the strategies and they came up with a plan. And really, this was the reason I bring this up is because it was so basic. And they said, we have 3 strategies. We're going to build partnerships with other organizations. We're going to focus just on building the skills of these women as they come out of prison and they're able to go to the next step in their lives. And the next door in this case is the door that opens for them next after they come out of prison. And we're going to focus on those people and those organizations that have the passion, the same passion that we have for this. And that will be this is our strategy. So all the funding that they solicit, all the support that they solicit, everything they solicit focuses on these 3 things. And basically they're telling people, this is what we're doing. This is our strategy. And so folks that believe in it and accept it are the ones that are part of it. So I wanted to just go through this example because, and it's obviously simplified quite a bit, but to show that strategy can be really that simple, or it can be that much of a process rather than something that has a lot more going on or a lot more pieces that people think need to be moving around a strategy. It can be this simple. I want to think a little bit about, since we're talking about our faith and we're talking about where does the faith part come in, or I like to say sometimes, where's the God piece in what we're talking about. Why do we do a strategic plan? We've talked about a little, we're going to talk a little bit more about what it is, but we know generically that it means to plan something out, especially if, we think that it's God's will. So I'll start from the bottom and go up, that whatever God's will is, will happen. So if we spend so much time and energy in creating a strategic plan, are we just wasting time? And is it something that we're going against God's will? And for some people that work in this space, it sounds like, well, that's kind of obvious. Of course, we have to plan, but sometimes just spelling it out for folks and letting people think about this more in an articulate way helps them think about why there is some importance to it, and also actually comes down to, well, people actually do think sometimes that if we're religious folks, or if we're, based in spirituality and faith, then are we actually saying that we don't have faith in God's will, so much that we have to create a plan? So I just want to put that out because I know that that exists. But the other side of it is, when you think about, when we bring in the God piece, and we think about that God has given us resources and gifts and ways of interacting, or ways of engaging, um, what are we doing with those gifts? And are we just using them sort of haphazardly, or are we actually, using them in a way that is, in this case, strategic, which means, essentially saying, are we wasting God's gifts to us by not using them properly and thinking about them in a strategic way? And the opportunities that He gives us, in this case, it could be, funding, or it could be something that helps us to do our work better. But if we're not taking advantage of it properly by having a plan or having strategy, etc., are we actually going against His will in some sense, or saying that we're not appreciative of His gifts? So that's something else, that we think about when we talk to folks about strategic planning, and they have some hesitancy. I like this quote from the Bible about, be very careful then how you live, not as unwise, but as wise, making the most of every opportunity. That really does speak to why we need to plan, in my mind, because making the most of every opportunity means that we're putting as much as we can, that effort and ability to do the right thing for that opportunity. So that's kind of a repeat of the focus, but I think it just kind of drives it home a little bit more. And the fact that if you do the planning to the extent that you can, and let God take, the planning that you have, or the effort you put into the planning, and of course it's going to be according to His will, but you've also put the effort and the time into it. So that these are just some thoughts I had about having to talk to people that actually have said, why do a street? This was kind of a question that people would ask me. Why would we have to do this if we are a faith-oriented or faith-based organization? The other thing a lot of people will say, and this is related, is this idea of visionary vision, which is a whole thing that folks have been talking about, which really just means that all you can see in your vision is the thing has to be done, and it's God's work, or it's a calling that I have to do, and therefore it's just going to get done regardless of a method to it. And I think we all know people, or even ourselves at some point, have felt that, which is, this is a true calling, so God will lead me and will make it happen. And my faith is something that I need to not both question, and also not get in the way of the work itself. But then, what this little quote here says from this information, from this study, or this write-up, is really then what happens is the vision gets blurred, and we start to see it in such a way that we don't see the reality in front of us. We're not really examining things because we've become so connected to this vision of doing the right thing, or doing God's work, and so on, that we may miss certain things. And what are those things? And what does that all mean? These are some ways that we can reflect before we plan, or before we even accept the idea of planning, that I've been thinking through, both in my own life and the work that I've been doing. And for example, why do we exist? And this is not a huge purpose question, but it really is, why do we, maybe as an organization, exist? Why do I exist as a faith leader in terms of my purpose? And related to that, obviously, is, what is God's purpose for what I'm doing? And to reflect on that. Sometimes, again, if you become this visionary vision person, you get stuck in the vision, but you don't actually ask the question of, what's the point? Why am I here? And why am I doing this? And then I think I would probably say some of us might go the other end and do that more than we should, which means asking, why am I here? Why am I doing that? Sometimes we get stuck there too. So I would like to propose a very balanced perspective on this, which is to reflect, but not get stuck in the reflection as well. So have a vision that's not blurry and a reflection that is balanced. Um, this third point in the top three bullets, how can we within limited resources really make a difference? That's kind of important because most of us in the work that we do have limited resources. And if we're not reflecting on making the difference with that, then we are going back to this idea of squandering our opportunities and our resources. So that's a concern. Now, I was thinking through, we've done some work with the CWFL on women's leadership and value-based and so on. So I was thinking through, as we're doing strategic planning or we're doing any kind of leadership, what are the values that sort of carry us through that, and maybe ones that we should think through. And I think I was thinking through, well, first of all, who are we answerable to? So as women of faith or as people of faith, whether we're activists or we're organizers or whatever, most of us will come back to the idea that, we're really answerable to a greater power and a greater purpose, for sure. But then we also think about, as a part of that accountability, we're also accountable to the people and the whoever our constituency is that we lead. And we know as people of faith that answerability to people around us is almost, I mean, it's pretty big. And so the first point that I think about is the trust that we carry. So if you're in leadership position, you're in a position of trust that both the people have put in us as leaders, but it's also the greater trust of this world, of this universe, of our lifetime, which is heavy. And I know that's sometimes enough reason for people to say, I don't want to be in leadership position and I don't want to have that trust, because a person of faith knows that to be true, that trust is important, the trust that we carry. So we think about that, and we think about, well, if you're going to recognize that trust and appreciate it, then the idea of strategic planning or doing anything that's going to be helpful for who those you're leading is going to be incredibly important. The second one about humility, about the ability, thinking a lot more about that recently too, which is sometimes we get into positions of leadership, and we think, well, we don't need necessarily a plan, or we don't need to think through strategy because we know it. We know what we're doing. Obviously, we know what we're doing because we're in this position of leadership. And it's not always that explicit. But if you start reflecting, you start to think about, well, wait a minute, am I thinking that I can do something just because I feel like I can't admit that I can't, first of all, or that it's something that my abilities or some, things that I need to really take a good look at and make sure that I have the capacity to do something. And that can get in the way. So it's both humility about that and then also an understanding of the abilities that we have. This third one I'm concerned about because intentionality is something a lot of people that come from faith or spiritual bases, we're always talking about intention. We're always talking about how you have to make intention, and God knows your intention, and your intention has to be pure. We're always using those terms, but when it comes to things like leadership, if we're not thinking about that or reflecting on it constantly, like, why am I doing this? And am I not doing strategic planning because my intention, is so good I don't need to do planning. I could really be that simple, and so on. So we want to be careful about our intentionality, and being authentic about it, and then saying, I think doing the self-reflection, I feel like my intention has changed a little bit. I kind of think that maybe I'm getting to a point where I feel good that people acknowledge me. And is that affecting my intention? And am I doing things in a way that are actually getting to me getting me to a different place? And that means it might actually affect the work that I do. And it might take me from a strategic place that I should be, but I'm not because of this, I would say, a distraction. The last thing that I know in the Muslim tradition is very big, but I know it's across all faiths and obviously non-faiths as well. But this idea of excellence, and that you are expected to do excellence in everything that you do, in all your actions, in all your intentions, and so on. But that really does bubble up to leadership in terms of saying, well, everything that I do has to be in the best mold as possible. Um, can I be excellent in everything? Probably not. But if my intention is to be, and then my efforts are towards excellence, then that's going to show in the way that I lead. It's going to show in the way that I connect. It's going to show in my relationships and so on. So that is those kind of nodes of values within the spiritual aspect of being a leader. I think are good reminders for myself as we have this conversation about strategic planning or planning at all, or even just leadership. So I wanted to throw those out. I don't know if anybody wants to reflect, give a reflection on these reflections. You're welcome to do that before we move on. And obviously, if there are things that you think we could add to this, which I'm sure there are, these are just kind of baseline. Um, but is there anything else you can think of value-wise that you think would be good to have as a reminder? But I'll let you think about it. If it takes you a while to type, that's fine. We can come back to your ideas.
I
Um,
actually have a
oh,
question that I might insert, a little bit of a
yes.
personal reflection. I was thinking about this the other day because in in scripture in Psalm 139:14 it talks about us being fearfully and wonderfully made. And I am fearfully and wonderfully made as a type B person. And so when it comes to kind of more of the type A aspects of strategic planning, now I guess my question is, what does strategic planning look like for women of faith who are just more type B in nature?
And by type B, you're admitting to,
Uh, I would say maybe
just so that we know we're all on the same page with how you
maybe
think of
more of
yourself.
that visionary than the, well, yeah, if I'm going full confession, maybe more the visionary aspect of it, and I kind of have to force myself into that place of logistics and minutia. Um,
Yeah.
so maybe it's a discipline, or I'm just curious what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, I think that's really important, Kristen, because what I'm looking at when we think about this strategic planning or leadership is ultimately you have to create that balance and you have to build the balance within yourself. Um, and it's what I'm finding is that many of us that are in these positions, or many of us that are sort of self-identified as leaders of faith, or faith-based and so on, um, we tend to go one way or the other. And it's very helpful to be able to say I'm type A and type B, and those are real. I mean, to the extent that they're real, but there are characteristics in us. Some of us, I have a very hard time sitting down and writing a whole plan out when I know I just want to do something and I just want to go get it done. Um, but I think what I would think through is there are times that you can be more visionary, and there are times when you kind of have to buckle down and do some more of the more nitty gritty, literally writing things out kind of thing. And you have to be cognizant of that. There are some times when you come up with an idea and you really just do need to do it because it is that kind of a passion and that kind of a drive that it has. I think what we're talking about could be a little bit more in terms of, how are you um, thinking about whether it's your life, right? If we're talking about ourselves as individuals, or you're thinking about it in terms of the organization, or something that you are in charge of, or custodian of, that's when it gets to, well, let's start thinking about the strategy in a way that makes sense. And even in this strategy, and when we go a little bit more detail about what a strategy is, you can bring that in. And I think bringing in spontaneity and bringing in that, sense of, um, I would say even wonder. So it's not like, a package deal. There's room to do that. And if you do that, you make your strategy, or you make whatever you do even more, I would say, exciting, more fulfilling for sure, and probably more impactful. So I don't know if that's exactly along the lines of what you were bringing up, but I do think there's a reason for balance, and there's also a reason to sort of connect these pieces together. So I don't think And I acknowledge that it's a challenge for folks, for all of us, to do one thing or the other. And I would say for type A friends of ours, they probably have a hard time doing this visionary thing, which is like, okay, let's stop talking about, the big picture. Let's just get down to it. And we need that. And so partly, as we move forward, we'll also talk about alliances and collaborations. We have to know who we are as a leader, as an individual, and say, you know what, I need somebody else, perhaps in this strategy planning or someone that has that other expertise or has that even other leaning, and let's work on this together because we know that this will be better and stronger and all of that. That's what I would suggest. um, yeah, integrating wonder. um, and you're asking about when and how should we do reflection, and should we do this individually with the group. That's great. I honestly, I think reflection has to be almost every step of the way. And I know people don't like to hear that because that they think, well, we're slowing down a process. But reflection really is not that heavy duty. It's just some of these questions, but it's also, I mean, if you can imagine just having some of these words, even like trust, humility, intention, excellence, written down somewhere for yourself. Not like this huge thing you're making everybody do, but even just for yourself. So you're connecting to that and almost on a daily, regular basis. That's a reflection. It doesn't mean you have to sit there and think about it every time. It's just something to sort of trigger you or to keep you sort of on a path that you can connect to. So I would say as often as possible, for sure. And I totally agree. I think it has to be individually and it has to be with a group, because you get a little bit of I've noticed, when you just do it individually, then you might have a little bit of a, what do they call those things? A very narrow scope. And when you do it as a group, you have, first of all, you hear other people's perspective. Obviously, you hear other people's experiences, and that can affect your reflection, which is great. And then you can also be reflective together, so people can hear, well, I'm not the only one that feels this way or sees it like this. So even if you picked a topic, I'm just thinking like humility or ability or something like that, and you talk as a group, how are we doing with our sense of ability? I mean, you don't have to talk about humility necessarily, but how do we feel about that? And it's nice to be able to hear people say, I think we could do better on this, or I need to build my skills on that. And then you start saying, well, this is great because we're really practicing humility here, right? Without having to say we need to be humble. It's about, how we respond and react. And then also, if you are in a leadership position, creating that space so people feel comfortable saying, you know, I feel like we don't have the ability to do this. Or, you know what, we're doing something really awesome and this is working so well. So it doesn't always have to be a negative sense. It can always very much, and it should be. And as a leader, we have to bring out the positive and the optimism. And I didn't actually add that, but the idea of optimism and the sense of things can work are so, so critical in leadership, and especially in strategic planning, because if you don't build in optimism, um, unfortunately, some people don't naturally incline toward optimism. But I think many studies will show that the feature of a very effective leader is to understand optimism as part of the strategy. So I would recommend that. But yeah, as much as reflection for everything, I think is good to do as much as possible. Um, so this is kind of the list of a little bit of the obvious, but it does help as a reminder. Like, why would you do a strategic plan? And here's a good list of things. And if you've worked in an organization, you know this, they're all important. But some of these, can be more important than others. And the idea of integrity, for example, that's in there, is really kind of critical. And I'll have to say that sometimes when I've talked with, um, I've worked with all sorts of organizations and entities, and sometimes when I work with non-faith based or non-religious based organizations and individuals, I've actually heard people say, the religious folks or the religious organizations, um, they're not always transparent, or they're not always, we don't always know what they're thinking or doing because they feel like they have to hold it together or have a close hold on things. And that's a little bit disconcerting, because it would seem that as a religious person or a person of faith, or and so on, that the idea of transparency, and we didn't put it with the values, but the idea of transparency is kind of critical, because you're admittedly or supposedly answering to something higher. So your idea of transparency should be even more important. So if you have a strategic plan, if you have something in place, then you're able to sort of show transparency through that, because here's my plan, here's what we're doing, here's why we're doing it, and here's how the third bullet, here's how we're able to show you that something is effective or not effective, because we're being transparent, because we're being strategic. And I want to emphasize, I think it'll come up again, but this idea of meeting the needs of the community. Again, a lot of times when you have the visionary vision, or you have all these other things going on, you come to a point, or many people have come to a point where you think, oh, I know what the community needs. I'm the visionary, or I'm the person that has been given this leadership position, so I do know, and they trust me to know. That brings the trust back. They trust me to know what the needs are. But when you have a strategic plan, you actually have to think about and know and be able to articulate the needs of the community in a much more authentic way than just saying, I know. Now, of course, this isn't just a faith-inspired discussion at all in that sense, because you can have anybody that's in a leadership position can say, I'm a leader, so I know what to do. So I would, that's why I wanted to emphasize that here. And obviously for organizational survival, having a plan in place and having a strategy and well thought out is going to be critical. Yeah, so then obviously the last point is just more of the same. But what should it include? And so now we get into kind of the nitty-gritty of a plan. And what are these things? Well, essentially what they are is some of the things that we talked about, kind of reviewing and evaluating who you are as an individual or as a culture of your organization. That's very critical. And that's part of it. This is who we are. This is how we define ourselves. Not who you're not. A lot of people do that too, but who you are. And it's kind of a statement of purpose and mission, but it's also, this is who we claim and we aim and we are as an organization. So the second thing is what I was just talking about, the community needs mapping and assessment. It's not just an assessment of, okay, our community needs this and therefore we're going to do this about it. A mapping is very interesting, and it's, as an anthropologist, I get really excited about the idea that you could go out and, first of all, talk to people. Not everybody does enough talking to people, or create these opportunities like a town hall meeting or a group, focus group, whatever it is that works in your community, to really be able to write them down, or at least record. Here's what has come up. Here are the patterns that I'm seeing as a community, and without imposing on them. So just like that example I started out with in Nashville, they didn't come up with ideas that to help the community. They were praying to do something, but instead of just thinking about what they thought would be good, and especially in that state, in that area, it's very much everybody should do what they need to do, and pull themselves up, and they should they should just do what is necessary. But here women that decided that no, these people here, they can't do it without our help, and this is what we're going to help them with, and specifically, and so on, based on what they learned about the community and what they needed. So very, very specific things. And then this third bullet about have your services become irrelevant. That speaks to humility, and it also speaks to all the other things we talked about with values, because maybe at some point what you're trying to do is not necessary or needed anymore, and that can hurt. It can be very, especially if you founded something and you've built something, when you come to that question, it could be like, well, you know what? Others are doing this and they're doing it much better. And maybe my resources and my time and energy can be spent elsewhere. But that's part of a strategic plan. So when you write the plan or you write these parts of it, you're going to show why you're still relevant. Okay. And then the other one, of course, is the partnering with and so on. So I know I'm probably taking more time than I need to, but let me see if, yeah, so this is just going to be more specifics about strategic planning. And a lot of these things you can find elsewhere, because you can just, what a plan needs to have. But I wanted to emphasize what's in the purple here. Strategic planning brings together all the parts of the organization. So you're talking about, if you have an organization, all these different elements, but you're also talking about the role that you play in that process. And it is a roadmap that we're building. I'm going to start going a little bit faster just because these are very specific things that I don't know if we need necessarily have time to go over each one. But again, and this one I wanted to emphasize here, strategic plan. It's not just that you just have to do it, so let's just get it done. It's actually about creating a culture of strategic thinking. So that means when you start thinking about strategy, and you start thinking about intentionality, you start thinking about the humility of ability, and so on. You're starting to, for yourself, first of all, but then also people that work with you, to think about everything strategically, which is kind of interesting because then you could change from a culture of we'll just do whatever needs to be done, or maybe a culture of a bunch of visionary, vision people, into wait, let me think about this, and let me think about that in a different way. Let me be reflective. Let me be mindful. So you're creating a culture in the work that you do, which really is, I think it harkens back to what we have trust, um, what we are as faith-based or as faith-inspired folks. These are the important parts of it, is that you're leaving something behind. And I think I didn't emphasize as much, but the idea that strategic planning is the process piece. It is, even the process of creating a strategic plan is so important. And it's not just the plan that you end up with, but the process that you do it with. You're connecting with people, you're figuring things out, you're doing that reflection, and so on. So you, through that process, you're creating this culture, which is so important, and maybe even more, what's the word, long lasting than a plan itself. So that's what I want to emphasize here, that culture piece. And so everybody's decision making also becomes strategic in that sense. And Kristen, your question about the words, I think we can come back to it very soon, because I'm throwing these words of strategic thinking, but it is also mindfulness. It is also intention, right? All these things are part of it. So lots and lots of specific things here about types of strategic planning. And I just want to, at the bottom, I put these 3 bullets, the idea that strategic plans can be inspirational. That means, and going back to your question about type A and B, it can be something that you come up with a plan that is inspired by certain things, and you can reflect that inspiration within it. It's also organic, so it changes according to what it needs to be responsive to. And it's also aligned, which means you can shift a little bit here and there with your plan as you need to, so you're not stuck in some rut, I would say, with a plan. And again, these are specific things that you can probably, these are generic parts of a strategic plan that you can find in many places, but this is what you would look like. And this is where it gets to this idea that, we have to be so specific, and then it sort of takes away from that sense of being organic or being just responsive. But if you look closely, all of these that look really dry and boring for those of us that are visionary, it eventually helps you think through all those other pieces, so you can come up with something that translates the vision and translates the passion in a way that is really doable and is definitely feasible as well. So then again, you'll see this in all kinds. These are all the little buzzwords that are everywhere, the SWOT and the SMART goals and so on. And it is a process. So that's the key of this conversation too, is if you can see that little the graphic there, the idea that it's all a process. And of course, you see at the end of this graphic, it says win. I think it says win. It says win there, which goes back to what we started with, is strategy just about winning? If you're general, if it's just making everybody come together to do something, it's not what it is. And as people looking for a win, and does that look like? Or you look for something that's a little bit more less either tangible or less defined. And I would put that to you as part of the what we're is, some people say, well, this just needs and my spiritual connection to what I do. That's all I do it. And then other people will say, well, and I talked about this earlier in terms of who we're answerable to. And some people will say, well, you can't please God if you don't do the right thing by the people that you serve, and so on and so forth. So would we actually replace that word win with something else? in this process. But at the same time, we have to think about what's the future of what we're trying to do. Why are we doing this? And are we, wasting resources and time by not doing it strategically? Now, here's a series of issues. I'm not going to go into detail at all, and I can, share this with you all, and it's also something that's very accessible. But the idea that if we don't do strategic planning, what will happen, but also what are some obstacles to it? And some things, for example, bureaucratization. If you have to be part of a bureaucracy in order to, you have to have a strategic plan to be part of something. That can really be frustrating, and it can also affect your values. So maybe, some of the values that people have as a faith-based organization are compromised. So are they compromised, or do you do them just to survive? And you can see here, there's a list from the Catholic Charities example that, people felt like, well, we don't want a strategic plan and strategic, work that will compromise something that we think is a basic part of who we are. So that could be a concern. The other thing is, in this case, government regulation. And so there are conversations about, well, if a regulation is such, then we as an organization, we can't, we have to put into our strategy or strategic planning that we will not do certain things. I know organizations, for example, that do in their strategic plan and in their vision and so on, they say they will not take money or funding from governments because they don't want to be in that, what they feel is a compromised situation. And so that's what they decide, and that's what they put inside, but it also can affect, people might think that will affect their strategy, but they just say it's not affecting it negatively necessarily. It's just we're recreating a strategy that's different, or that's going to go around that that thing that's in their way or something like that. So that's another piece to think about. And now we're getting into how organizations behave and are structured, but this is part of the strategic thinking as well. This is kind of important because the idea that in our work, it goes back to the visionary vision thing, and also to the idea that we're doing something for the greater good and for God and for everything else that's not that's intangible to others and so on. It goes back to, well, this organizational work I'm doing is so critical and so important that only I can do it. And that's not necessarily, in some ways it can be an arrogance or a anti-humility stance. But for some people, they really take what they're doing very seriously, and they do think it's something that they don't want to let go of in a way that would be a detriment to it. So it's this founder syndrome idea that whatever is there, it has to stay in that way. And sometimes actually, it's not the founder that actually feels that way. It's other people feel that way, and they think that well, we can't exist without the founder, or we can't exist without this individual because they're the ones that made this happen. Well, in strategic planning and all of that, you put that into place, into saying, no, actually, we have to have a succession. What do you call it? A plan. Part of the strategy is to have that plan, so both the founder and others don't feel like this work is dependent on one person, because we need to nurture others, and part of the plan should be to nurture the growth of other individuals, leaders, even people that are just in an organization. What is that plan that helps them through it? So it's going to be pretty critical. The last thing I'll just put up here in terms of the limitations is, if you're working in organizations that are applying for funding, that could be an issue where it's the funding is asking you to create a strategic plan that you may have difficulty with, or you might be just reacting to the funding. So it's a funding for something, so you're going to change your strategy in order to meet that funding goal. So is that compromising, or is that just surviving? And sometimes you just want to do some immediate work rather than something that's long-term, and that's not necessarily something that's in the strategic planning as well. So those are just parts of this idea of survival versus compromise. And so those are real parts of the strategy process. So I think I'm almost done. The strategic planning is alive. I wanted to bring that back up again. It's not set in stone. It's not something that's in place that nobody can touch or have impact on. It really is something we have to think of as what we're building as we move together. Um, and again, these are the same questions we kind of asked a little bit earlier. But if we're not able to be reflective in what we're doing and how we're doing it, then what do we think about? How do we think about redoing it differently? And maybe it is that, we need to think about not existing as an organization in one case, or even in a leadership position, shifting that and so on. But if we don't embed in the strategic planning the sense of change, then I think we're not going to get very far. So I think I'm almost done. Let me just double check. Yeah. So this is just a saying of the Prophet Muhammad, who, and you've seen iterations of this in so many different ways, but he would say, pray to God and tie your camel. And he gave lots of examples of that when people would say to him, well, we have faith. This won't happen. So whether it was a lot of different incidents actually in his own lifetime where people would be questioning him. Well, why are you spending so much time planning something out when you know that God is going to do? I mean, you're the prophet, basically, is what they would be saying to him. You're the prophet. Why would you need to plan? And he would say very clearly to them, and we have this in so many traditions, he would say the same as you see here, but to the extent that if you're not actually doing the process of planning, then your trust in God is not well placed, because God himself is telling you to use your ideas, to use your abilities and so on, to do the right thing and do the best thing. And if you're not doing that, you're actually countering what he has asked us to do. So tying your camel, you may have faith that your camel won't walk away, but if you don't tie your camel, you've already given it sort of, its fate is already secured by your inaction to do something that is obvious, first of all, and is also kind of important towards what needs to be done. So that's all to say, I think, in terms of how we are working now and dealing with things together, whether it's, building community in what we're doing now, whether it's connecting across diversity, especially in this day and age. How are we doing that intentionally? How are we doing that strategically? And how are we doing that in a way that people understand is not giving up to negativity or giving up to the sense of, loss in some ways? And how do we realign that so we can say, no, if we put in the work of connection and the work of connectivity and healing and so on, we're actually doing what we believe is our faith, which is that God will, or the greater purpose will affect that work in a way that's positive and eventually be something that's effective for everybody. I think I just like this picture, and that's why I kept it. And the bullets are sort of redundant in some ways, but I liked what the picture had to say. So I think I'll end there. If there are some questions, if we want to interact a little bit more, I'm happy to do that. I don't know if, Kristen, you want to chime in with what you've been thinking about in terms of your question about words after this discussion and what we've been saying, if you think of something else.
No, actually, as you went forward, there were a lot of words that you used, and interestingly enough, a lot of your words of mindfulness and intentionality. I think as a woman of faith, that very much strikes a chord and gets me more excited about planning rather than calling it strategic planning. I feel like sometimes the terminologies that we use can oftentimes be a barrier to engaging in the process just because of the perception around it. And so, yeah, you used a lot of really good alternatives as you were going through that I've been jotting down in my little notebook. So, yeah, thank you. It's been really helpful. I see that Sarah is typing down in the chat box. So we'll go ahead and just give her a second. But I did want to be just respectful of people's time since we are at the 2 o'clock hour. And oh, I see that Sarah's question came through. Where would you recommend individuals, organizations start in this process if they have done little formal, intentional, strategic planning before? So
Oh,
maybe we'll go ahead and take that question, and then we'll close out after that.
okay. Hi, Sarah. I think that's there are actually a lot of places and that are geared towards faith organizations. I can send around maybe some links if you'd like me to do that, or what do you think, Kristen? I mean, or I'm trying to think of what would be the most effective way to do it. But there,
Yeah, we can share the PowerPoint and also any links that you have on our website and include
okay,
it with this video.
okay, um, yeah, yeah, and I just wanted to make the point that you were saying, Kristen, about words, but I wanted to say also, we sometimes we have to put more effort into translating what we're doing already into language that translates into, if you want to call it the secular world or whatever it is, because we are doing much of this in some format or the other, or like you were saying, to make it more something that folks that come from this space can also understand. So there has to be a little bit of that translation back and forth. And sometimes you have to use words or terminology from that other space, but qualify it and help other people to understand what it is as well.
Wonderful. Well, Afeefa, I just want to thank you so much for serving as our speaker today. You went through a lot of content with us, and you did it very eloquently and in time. And so I'm always amazed at what you're able to do in an hour. It's wonderful. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. You're welcome.
And as I said, we'll be posting Afifa's video and the resources along with that. And can, if it's okay with you, Afifa can also share your contact information with the people on the session if they have any follow-up questions that they might have.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
Wonderful. Um, so to close out, I just wanted to let everybody know about the next webinar in our series that's going to be happening on December 7th at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It's called Spirituality and Skyscrapers, Advancement as Women of Faith in the Corporate Sector. And that's going to be led by one of our advisory council members, Dr. Julie Scheimer. And the link to enter that room is provided in the chat box below. So I hope you all can join us for that next session in December, and hopefully we will be seeing you soon. I hope everybody has a great day. Thank you for joining us.